The house had felt different for months. Rachel and I weren't fighting, at least not openly, but the quiet tension in our marriage had become impossible to ignore. We'd been married for 20 years, but lately, it felt like we were just two strangers living under the same roof. I chalked it up to Emily leaving for college. The empty nest thing was harder than I expected, and I figured Rachel felt the same way. I told myself we'd find our rhythm again with time. That's what people always say, right? When Emily came home for Christmas break, it was like the house came alive again. She was her usual bubbly self, filling the silences with chatter about college life, her classes, her new friends, and even a boy she was sort of seeing. It felt good to have her around. She was always the glue that held us together, even when Rachel and I were barely making it work. One afternoon, she came into the living room holding Rachel's old laptop. She'd asked to borrow it for a school project because her own laptop was acting up. I was half watching some football game, already thinking ahead to the family dinner we'd planned for later. "Dad," she said, her voice unusually serious. "Can I talk to you for a second?" I muted the TV and turned to her. Emily looked uneasy, her brow furrowed in that way it did when she was trying to figure out how to say something difficult. "What's up, kiddo?" She hesitated, holding the laptop like it was something fragile. I was looking through Mom's files on here, trying to find a folder to save my stuff in. "And well," she trailed off, her eyes darting to the screen. That's when I noticed her hands trembling just slightly. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. "What is it?" Instead of answering, she handed me the laptop. The screen showed a folder labeled Personal Notes, and within it were dozens of files. Some bookmarked web pages, others saved PDFs. At first glance, it looked like the kind of stuff Rachel might use for her side business selling handmade jewelry and spiritual trinkets. But then I started reading the titles. Binding Spells for Control, How to Subjugate a Partner's Will, Emotional Dependency Rituals. What the hell is this? I muttered, more to myself than to Emily. She perched on the arm of the couch beside me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Dad. I didn't want to keep looking without showing you." Clicking through the files, I found detailed instructions on how to perform spells, real, actual spells, meant to manipulate someone emotionally and mentally. A bookmarked page was titled How to Make Your Partner Obey You. My hands gripped the laptop tighter as I scanned the text. This wasn't just some quirky interest Rachel was dabbling in. It was dark. Then I found the emails. Rachel had been corresponding with someone who called themselves Mrs. Mithril. The messages started off innocuous enough. Rachel asking for advice on spellwork, tips for harnessing energy. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. Mrs. Mithril encouraged Rachel to focus her efforts on me, to isolate me emotionally, to bind my will so I'd be more compliant. One message even suggested creating a charm to make me docile. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I read Rachel's replies. She wasn't just entertaining these ideas. She was eager, thanking Mrs. Mithril for her guidance and promising to follow through with the rituals. Emily was silent beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Dad," she said softly, "what does this mean?" I didn't know how to answer her. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some harmless hobby. This was Rachel actively plotting to manipulate me, to control me in ways I hadn't even imagined. "It means," I started, then paused, struggling to find the words. "It means your mom has been keeping a lot of secrets from us." Emily nodded slowly, her expression a mix of fear and sadness. "What are you going to do?" I closed the laptop and set it aside, leaning back into the couch. My hands were still shaking. "I don't know yet," I admitted. But one thing was clear. This wasn't something I could ignore. Whatever was going on with Rachel, it went deeper than I ever could have imagined. And I needed to figure out just how far it went. That night, I couldn't sleep. Emily had gone up to her room, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts and the laptop that now felt like a ticking bomb. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words from those files flashing behind my eyelids. Bind your partner's will. Subjugate emotions. And then, Mrs. Mithril. Who the hell was Mrs. Mithril? How had Rachel even found someone like that? I spent hours scrolling through more of the files and emails. Rachel's conversations with Mrs. Mithril revealed a relationship that was disturbingly intimate. Not in a romantic way, but in the sense that Rachel trusted this woman implicitly. She confided in her about our marriage, about my stubbornness, and how she felt like she couldn't get through to me anymore. One email stood out. "Mrs. Mithril, I've tried reasoning with Michael, but he's so resistant. He always needs to feel in control. I love him, but sometimes I think the only way to save our marriage is to make him see things my way, even if he doesn't realize it." Mrs. Mithril's reply was chilling. "It's understandable, Rachel. Men like Michael often need a nudge to align their energy with yours. The binding spell is perfect for this, gentle but effective. It will help him become more open to your guidance. Trust the process, and don't hesitate to reach out if you need support." Trust the process? This wasn't couples counseling. This was manipulation in its purest form. It didn't stop there. Another thread of emails revealed that Rachel had already tried a small-scale ritual, something involving a charm bracelet she'd hidden in our bedroom. Mrs. Mithril had guided her step by step, instructing her to infuse the bracelet with binding energy and ensure I wore it. My stomach turned as I realized Rachel might have already started testing these methods on me without my knowledge. By the time the clock hit 3 a.m., I had seen enough. My wife wasn't just dabbling in witchcraft for fun. She was fully committed to using it as a weapon against me. The next morning, I made an excuse to stay home from work, telling Rachel I wasn't feeling well. She gave me a concerned look but didn't press further, probably relieved that I wasn't pestering her about anything. Once she left for her errands, I got to work. First, I searched the house for anything that might be connected to her rituals. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was some paranoid husband snooping through his wife's things, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't afford to ignore the signs. In the bottom drawer of her nightstand, under some old journals and receipts, I found it, the charm bracelet. It looked innocent enough, just a simple string of beads with a small silver pendant. But when I picked it up, I felt an odd sensation, like static electricity buzzing faintly against my skin. I dropped it immediately, my pulse racing. My mind raced with questions. Had she tried to make me wear this? Was this part of the gentle manipulation Mrs. Mithril had encouraged? I carefully wrapped the bracelet in a cloth and set it aside. My next move was to dig deeper into who this Mrs. Mithril really was. Rachel had used a secret email account for her correspondence, one I'd found by sheer luck while combing through her files. With a little effort, I managed to log in using a password she'd once mentioned in passing, our wedding anniversary. It felt wrong to invade her privacy, but at the same time, she'd already crossed so many lines that my guilt was fleeting. The inbox was a goldmine. Mrs. Mithril wasn't just some random online mentor. She ran an entire operation. Her emails were filled with links to private forums, paid courses on advanced ritual techniques, and testimonials from other women who had supposedly succeeded in transforming their partners using her methods. I clicked on one of the links, which led to a forum filled with discussions about everything from spellcasting to emotional manipulation tactics. It was unsettling to read post after post from people sharing their success stories, talking about how their partners had become more compliant, more loving, more perfect. It wasn't just witchcraft, it was psychological warfare, cloaked in mystical language. By the time Rachel came home that afternoon, I had a mountain of evidence. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. If I played my cards wrong, she'd deny everything and destroy the proof. So I played it cool, even as she breezed through the door and kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong. My stomach churned, but I smiled and asked her how her day had been. Inside, though, I was boiling. I didn't just feel betrayed, I felt violated. Rachel hadn't just lied to me, she tried to alter the very fabric of our relationship without my consent. And as much as I hated to admit it, this wasn't just about me anymore. Emily had stumbled onto this first, and if she hadn't, I might never have known. Whatever came next, I had to handle it carefully, for both of us. For the next few days, I maintained the facade of normalcy. Rachel seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing under the surface. If anything, she appeared happier than usual, smiling more often, humming while she cooked, even pausing to make small talk. On the surface, it looked like everything was fine. But to me, every interaction felt like walking through a minefield. Emily, on the other hand, couldn't hide her unease. She avoided Rachel as much as possible, staying in her room or heading out with friends. Whenever we were alone, she would quietly ask if I'd figured out what to do yet. I could only reassure her that I was working on it, though deep down, I still wasn't sure what the right move was. One thing was certain. I needed help. Whatever Rachel was doing with Mrs. Mithril's guidance wasn't just some harmless phase. It was calculated and deliberate. It went beyond lies or betrayal. It was a violation of trust that cut to the core of our marriage. After a restless night of turning possibilities over in my head, I decided to contact a lawyer. A colleague at work had once mentioned Jennifer Stone, a tough and highly regarded attorney with a reputation for being both sharp and discreet. I wasn't ready to talk about divorce, but I needed to understand my options and how to protect myself and Emily if things escalated. Jennifer agreed to see me later that week. On the day of the appointment, I made up a story about meeting an old friend for lunch and left the house, making sure not to arouse suspicion. Rachel barely glanced up from her magazine as I walked out, which only deepened the sinking feeling in my gut. Jennifer's office was as polished and efficient as her reputation suggested. Sitting across from her, I laid everything out: the files, the emails to Mrs. Mithril, and the charm bracelet I'd found. As I spoke, Jennifer listened intently, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to serious concern. When I finished, she didn't mince words. She confirmed that the situation was highly unusual but also deeply troubling. This wasn't just a case of a strained marriage or a hidden affair. It was a clear attempt to manipulate and control me. Her advice was to document everything carefully and avoid confronting Rachel until I was absolutely prepared for the fallout. Jennifer outlined the potential legal angles. She mentioned that the evidence I'd already collected would be invaluable if things came to a divorce, particularly since it painted a picture of manipulation and deceit. She also stressed the importance of keeping calm and strategic, reminding me that acting impulsively could jeopardize my position. When I left her office, I felt a mix of relief and dread. On one hand, I had a clearer sense of what I needed to do. On the other, the reality of the situation felt heavier than ever. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation or a quick fix. Rachel had gone too far, and whatever came next would have to be carefully planned. Back at home, Rachel was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something fragrant on the stove. She greeted me with a smile, asking how my day had gone. Her demeanor was so warm, so normal, that for a brief moment, I almost believed the lie. Then I noticed the charm bracelet sitting on the counter, next to a pile of unopened mail. My heart sank. She must have found it in the drawer where I'd hidden it. Without missing a beat, Rachel picked it up, turning it over in her hands. She asked if I'd misplaced it, her tone light and casual, as if she were commenting on the weather. I nodded, forcing a neutral expression, and took it from her when she handed it back. The bracelet felt heavier than it had before, as though it carried all the weight of what I now knew. I tucked it into my pocket and thanked her, careful not to let my voice betray the whirlwind of emotions brewing inside me. That small moment solidified what I already knew. I was running out of time. Rachel might not have been suspicious yet, but she was close. Whatever she had planned, I had to stay one step ahead. She'd made her move, and now it was my turn. As the days passed, I began piecing together a clearer picture of what Rachel had been up to. Each night, after Rachel went to bed, I revisited her files, emails, and bookmarks. It was like peeling back the layers of a puzzle, one that revealed a version of Rachel I'd never known. The woman who laughed at my bad jokes and spent years raising Emily alongside me had been systematically plotting to strip away my independence. The correspondence with Mrs. Mithril spanned months, maybe longer. It painted a chilling picture of Rachel's mindset. Initially, her emails were tentative, asking questions about spells for harmony or emotional balance. But they quickly escalated into discussions about control and dominance. Mrs. Mithril's replies were always encouraging, always validating Rachel's feelings. She referred to her methods as empowering, and assured Rachel that the results would bring her happiness. There was one thread in particular that stood out. Rachel had mentioned a growing dissatisfaction in our relationship, complaining about how I never listened and how she felt invisible. Mrs. Mithril had replied with a spell recommendation, a ritual to make me emotionally dependent on Rachel, to draw me closer to her without my awareness. That was when Rachel began exploring binding spells. I found bookmarked instructions detailing how to gather personal items, hair, a watch, even worn clothing, to infuse with energy. It made my skin crawl to think of how much she'd likely taken from me without my knowing. The charm bracelet wasn't the only thing. Tucked into the back of Rachel's jewelry box, I found a small pouch containing what looked like strands of my hair, tied together with red thread. Next to it was a folded piece of paper covered in symbols and phrases I couldn't understand. It was like something out of a movie, except it was happening in my house. I carefully photographed everything and returned it exactly as I'd found it. Confronting Rachel was tempting, but I knew better than to act impulsively. Instead, I brought my findings to Jennifer. When I showed her the photos, she studied them with the same critical eye she'd used on the initial emails. Her reaction was measured but firm. This was further proof of Rachel's deliberate attempts at manipulation. She reiterated the importance of staying calm and gathering as much evidence as possible. "Michael," she said, her tone serious, "if this goes to court, you need to be prepared for her to deny everything. The more proof you have, the harder it will be for her to spin the narrative in her favor." Her words stuck with me. For all her cheerfulness and seeming normalcy at home, Rachel was operating on a completely different level behind the scenes. I couldn't afford to underestimate her. Back at home, I kept my distance from Rachel as much as possible. When she asked why I seemed distracted, I blamed work. She accepted the excuse easily enough, probably relieved that I wasn't prying into her business. Emily, meanwhile, was growing more anxious. One evening, as I passed by her room, she called me in and shut the door behind us. "Dad, you can't just let this keep going," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Mom's acting like everything's fine, and it's not. You have to do something." She was right. Every day that passed felt like Rachel was gaining ground, tightening her grip on whatever plan she had in mind. But I couldn't just rush in and confront her without a solid strategy. "I will," I assured Emily, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But we need to be smart about this. I'm not going to let her blindside us." Emily nodded, though her expression remained troubled. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind churned with everything I'd uncovered. The charm bracelet, the pouch of hair, the emails to Mrs. Mithril, it all pointed to one conclusion. Rachel wasn't just trying to manipulate me. She wanted complete control. And if I didn't act soon, she might just succeed. The days blurred together as I juggled keeping up appearances and digging deeper into Rachel's schemes. On the surface, life in our house carried on as if nothing was wrong. Rachel spent her days running errands, working on her business, and occasionally planning dinners that felt forced, like she was trying to project an image of the perfect family. Meanwhile, I focused on gathering as much evidence as I could. Each evening, after Rachel went to bed, I pored over her files and emails, methodically documenting everything. The sheer amount of material was overwhelming. Notes on spells, detailed rituals, and even references to specific phases of the moon. It was clear that Rachel hadn't just stumbled into this, she was deeply committed. The correspondence with Mrs. Mithril remained central to my investigation. It seemed like Mrs. Mithril had taken on the role of a mentor, guiding Rachel step by step. One thread described how to isolate a partner emotionally, encouraging Rachel to create scenarios where I'd feel dependent on her for support. Another suggested ways to subtly undermine my confidence, framing it as rebalancing the power dynamic. Rachel had even written about specific moments in our marriage, painting me as dismissive or distant. Reading her words felt like a betrayal in itself. She didn't just want to control me, she genuinely believed she was justified in doing so. The charm bracelet and the pouch of hair continued to weigh on my mind. They weren't just symbols of her efforts, they were tangible evidence of how far she was willing to go. I kept them hidden, knowing that revealing my hand too soon could backfire. Emily grew more withdrawn as the tension in the house became harder to ignore. She spent most of her time in her room, avoiding Rachel whenever possible. When she did come downstairs, her interactions with Rachel were clipped and polite, but the distance was unmistakable. Rachel, for her part, either didn't notice or chose not to address it. I could see the strain in Emily's eyes, the unspoken questions she wanted answers to but was too afraid to voice. Her trust in her mother had been shattered, and I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to protect her from the fallout. One evening, as Rachel prepared dinner, I caught sight of her carefully arranging a new centerpiece on the dining table. It was a collection of candles and crystals, arranged in a way that seemed deliberate. She moved with precision, muttering softly under her breath, though I couldn't make out the words. Watching her in that moment, I felt a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't the woman I'd married. The Rachel I knew would have laughed at the idea of manipulating someone, let alone her own husband. But now, she was consumed by it, her actions driven by a belief that she was somehow fixing our marriage. The divide between us grew wider with each passing day. At night, I lay awake, listening to the faint sound of Rachel breathing beside me, wondering how she could sleep so peacefully while orchestrating something so insidious. I knew I couldn't keep up the charade forever. The longer I waited, the more entrenched Rachel became in her plans. It wasn't just about protecting myself anymore, it was about shielding Emily from the damage Rachel was causing. The pieces of my plan were coming together, but the weight of what lay ahead was suffocating. I had to be patient, strategic, and, above all, ready for whatever came next. The tension in the house had become a living thing, settling into every corner. Rachel seemed blissfully unaware of the growing distance between us, but I noticed every detail, the way she hummed while preparing her strange new centerpieces, the faint smell of incense that lingered in the air after she'd spent hours alone in her office. She seemed more engrossed in her rituals than ever, and it only confirmed that her plans were escalating. I spent my free time compiling everything I'd gathered. The emails to Mrs. Mithril painted a chilling picture of Rachel's state of mind. She'd convinced herself that her actions weren't just justified but necessary. Mrs. Mithril encouraged this mindset, responding to Rachel's doubts with reassurances that manipulating me was an act of love, a way to restore balance to our relationship. It was the physical evidence that haunted me most. The charm bracelet, the pouch of hair, and now a small notebook I'd found tucked into her desk drawer. The notebook contained pages filled with handwritten notes, fragments of spell instructions, lists of items she'd used, and dates corresponding to phases of the moon. Some of the entries were marked with check marks, suggesting she'd already completed those rituals. One page stopped me cold. It was titled The Compliance Spell. The instructions detailed how to create an object imbued with energy that would make the wearer more suggestible. The charm bracelet I'd found fit the description perfectly. Beneath the instructions, Rachel had written in her neat, precise handwriting, "Tried on Michael during argument about money. Seemed less agitated afterward. Need to repeat for stronger results." I felt sick reading it. She had already started testing her spells on me. How much of my behavior over the past few months had been my own, and how much had been influenced by Rachel's manipulations? That evening, I brought the notebook to Jennifer. She was unfazed by its contents, her sharp, analytical mind immediately recognizing its value as evidence. She urged me to keep documenting everything, emphasizing that the notebook would be hard for Rachel to refute in a legal setting. Jennifer also suggested I consider taking proactive steps to protect myself and Emily. She mentioned the possibility of obtaining a restraining order if Rachel's behavior escalated or if I felt unsafe. The thought seemed extreme, but it planted a seed in my mind. Back at home, I tried to act normal, but every interaction with Rachel felt like a performance. I watched her closely, noting the small shifts in her demeanor, the way her eyes lingered on me when she thought I wasn't looking, the satisfied smirk that sometimes played at the corners of her mouth. She was convinced her plans were working, that I was none the wiser. Emily continued to grow more distant. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the back porch, staring out at the yard with a faraway look in her eyes. She barely acknowledged me as I sat down beside her. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "It's like she's not even Mom anymore." Her voice was flat, emotionless, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. I didn't know how to respond. How could I explain to her that I felt the same way, that the woman I'd shared my life with for 2 decades had become a stranger? Instead, I put a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that I would do whatever it took to protect her. That night, I stayed up late, poring over Rachel's files one last time. I had everything I needed, proof of her manipulation, her correspondence with Mrs. Mithril, and her growing obsession with control. But knowing wasn't enough. I had to act. Rachel had made her move, and now it was my turn to take the first step in dismantling everything she'd built. After weeks of preparation, I finally felt ready to act. Rachel had no idea how much I knew or how long I'd been watching her every move. As far as she was concerned, everything was going according to her plan. But in truth, I had been quietly dismantling her schemes piece by piece. The first part of my counterplan was simple: expose her. I started by creating backups of every piece of evidence I'd collected: her emails with Mrs. Mithril, photos of the charm bracelet and the pouch of hair, and even scans of her handwritten notebook. I stored the files in multiple locations: a secure cloud account, a USB drive I kept at work, and another copy with Jennifer. There would be no way for Rachel to destroy everything, no matter how hard she tried. Next, I turned my attention to Emily. She had been patient, but I could see the strain in her every time we interacted. She deserved to know that I had a plan and that things were finally moving forward. One evening, I sat her down and explained, in broad strokes, what I was about to do. "I've got everything I need to protect us," I told her. "But when it all comes out, it's going to get messy." Emily nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and worry. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said. Her words stuck with me as I prepared for the next step, exposing Rachel's infidelity. Among the many unsettling discoveries I'd made was the realization that Rachel wasn't just focused on controlling me, she was also planning an affair. Her emails included exchanges with a man named Stephen Ross, a supplier for her business. They had been communicating for months, and while their early messages were professional, they quickly turned personal. Stephen wasn't just some casual fling. He was part of Rachel's long-term plan. In one email, she had written to Mrs. Mithril about her intention to manipulate me into becoming more docile, paving the way for her to pursue other opportunities without resistance. The thought of Rachel plotting an affair while simultaneously trying to control me filled me with a cold, simmering rage. Using the same method I'd employed to uncover Rachel's secrets, I tracked down Stephen's personal life. He was married, and his wife, Cassandra, deserved to know what was happening. I drafted an email to her, attaching the most incriminating messages between Rachel and Stephen. It wasn't an easy decision, but Cassandra had a right to the truth. After hitting send, I turned my attention to Stephen himself. That evening, I called him directly. The conversation was brief and to the point. I let him know I had shared everything with Cassandra and had also forwarded the evidence to his employer. His response was predictable: denial, followed by anger, and finally panic. "I don't think you understand what you've gotten yourself into," I said calmly before hanging up. The final piece of my plan involved Rachel herself. 4 days, I watched her closely, waiting for the right moment. It came one evening when she seemed particularly confident, even smug. She had cooked dinner, setting the table with an air of ceremony, and spent the meal talking about plans for the future. Vacations, renovations, even a possible expansion of her business. Her demeanor made it clear she believed she had everything under control. But as I listened, pretending to engage, I felt a surge of resolve. After dinner, Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table, smiling as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small charm, a new one, unfamiliar to me. She placed it on the table between us, her expression unreadable. "This," she said, gesturing to the charm, "is about aligning our energy. It's going to help us get back on the same page." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. My heart was pounding, but I refused to let her see any sign of weakness. "Tell me more," I said. As she launched into an explanation of its supposed spiritual benefits, I let her words wash over me, already planning my next move. Rachel thought she was tightening her grip, but she had no idea how close she was to losing everything. Later that night, I sent Jennifer a message, letting her know that I was ready to proceed. It was time to bring everything to light. Rachel had built her web carefully, but I had the tools to unravel it, and I wasn't going to wait any longer. The night Rachel unveiled her latest spiritual alignment plan was when I decided it was time to confront her. She'd grown more emboldened, moving from subtle manipulations to outright declarations of her supposed control. As she sat across from me at the kitchen table, talking about the charm she'd crafted, I saw her confidence, her certainty that she held all the cards. But I was holding something far more powerful: the truth. After she finished explaining the charm, I nodded as though considering her words carefully. Inside, I was bracing for what came next. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms, and asked her a simple question. "Rachel," I began, keeping my tone steady, "do you ever feel guilty about the things you've done to me? To us?" The question caught her off guard. Her smile faltered, and she tilted her head slightly, trying to read my expression. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. I let the silence stretch, watching her closely. Then, without a word, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the charm bracelet she'd made. Placing it on the table between us, I let the weight of the moment settle. Her reaction was immediate, a flicker of recognition, followed by a forced laugh. "Oh, that old thing. I was just experimenting. You're not seriously upset about that, are you? I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for my phone and opened a folder containing the photos of her notebook, the emails to Mrs. Mithril, and the charm's description. I slid the phone across the table, the screen angled toward her. Rachel's eyes widened as she scrolled through the evidence. The color drained from her face, and her hands began to tremble. You went through my things? She asked, her voice rising with a mix of anger and panic. I had to, I replied evenly. You left me no choice. For a moment she was silent, staring at the screen as though willing the evidence to disappear. Then, she pushed the phone away and leaned forward, her expression hardening. You don't understand, she said. Everything I've done has been for us. For this family. Her voice cracked, but I wasn't moved. For us. I repeated, my voice sharper now. Manipulating me, trying to control me with spells, planning an affair. That's for us? Rachel's eyes flickered with defiance. I was trying to fix what you wouldn't, she shot back. You've been so distant, so cold. I needed to find a way to bring us back together. And Stephen Ross? I asked, my tone icy. Was he part of that plan too? Her face froze, and for the first time, she seemed truly cornered. She stammered, searching for a response, but I didn't let her speak. Cassandra knows everything, I continued, watching the shock ripple across her features. So does Stephen's employer. Whatever fantasy you were building with him, it's over. Rachel's defiance crumbled. She slumped back in her chair, her hands covering her face. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she muttered, her voice muffled. I wanted to feel pity, but all I felt was anger. It got this far because you made it happen, I said, standing up. You lied, you manipulated, and you betrayed me. And now, you're going to deal with the consequences. Without waiting for her response, I walked away, leaving her alone at the table. Upstairs, Emily was waiting in her room, her door slightly ajar. She looked up as I entered, her face filled with worry. It started, I told her quietly. Emily nodded, her expression firm. What happens now? She asked. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Rachel's web of lies was beginning to unravel, and I wasn't going to stop until the truth came out completely. The confrontation with Rachel left the air in the house heavy, almost suffocating. She spent the following days walking on eggshells, her usual confidence replaced by an uneasy tension. It was clear she was trying to gauge how much damage had been done and how much I truly knew. I, on the other hand, stayed calm and deliberate, carefully managing the situation while finalizing my next moves. Rachel's attempt to carry on with her routines felt almost pathetic. She still cooked dinner, still flipped through her magazines in the evening, but the strain in her every movement was impossible to miss. Emily avoided her entirely, staying in her room or slipping out to spend time with friends. The dynamic in the house had shifted completely, and Rachel was acutely aware of it. Behind the scenes, the fallout from my counterplan had begun to take shape. Cassandra, Stephen's wife, responded to my email almost immediately. Her reply was brief and furious, promising to confront Stephen and thanking me for bringing the truth to light. Meanwhile, Stephen's workplace had acknowledged receipt of the forwarded evidence and initiated an internal review. It was only a matter of time before the repercussions hit Rachel directly. Stephen, desperate to salvage his own life, tried to contact her repeatedly. I noticed her phone buzzing with his name more than once, though she never answered. I imagined he was panicking, trying to convince her to help mitigate the damage, but Rachel seemed too consumed by her own unraveling plans to respond. What struck me most was how Rachel's defenses crumbled. She made no real effort to deny the accusations or refute the evidence. Instead, she seemed paralyzed, alternating between anger at being exposed and desperate attempts to justify her actions. She avoided direct confrontation, leaving the house for long stretches during the day and returning only when it was clear I had retreated to my room for the night. Emily, though outwardly composed, was struggling. I found her one evening sitting on the porch, her knees drawn up to her chest. She didn't say much, but her silence spoke volumes. The betrayal had hit her hard, and I knew it would take time for her to process everything. In the meantime, I worked with Jennifer to formalize the next steps. The evidence I had gathered was airtight, and Jennifer was confident that we could leverage it to secure a strong position in divorce proceedings. She also suggested filing for temporary restraining orders against both Rachel and Stephen if they showed signs of retaliation, though so far, neither had made any overt moves. The final blow came 2 days later when Rachel's parents, who had always been traditional and deeply invested in maintaining the family's image, called me. They had heard from Cassandra about the affair and were livid. Rachel's father, a stern man who rarely raised his voice, expressed his disappointment and disgust in no uncertain terms. They wanted to meet to discuss how to handle the situation, but I declined, unwilling to expose Emily to another layer of tension. Rachel returned home that evening visibly shaken, likely having heard from her parents. She didn't speak to me or Emily, heading straight to her room and locking the door behind her. For once, the house felt almost peaceful without her presence looming over us. I knew the days ahead would be chaotic, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control. Rachel's carefully constructed web of lies and manipulation had been torn apart, and now she was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. The power dynamic had shifted, and this time, I wasn't the one being controlled. The house felt quieter in the days that followed, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that signaled the aftermath of a storm. Rachel moved through the house like a ghost, barely acknowledging either Emily or me. Her usual routines had dissolved into long hours spent in her room, punctuated by tense phone calls that she tried, and failed, to keep private. Her unraveling was obvious. She'd stop mid-conversation with herself, pacing and muttering under her breath. More than once, I heard the name Stephen spoken in frustration, followed by bursts of silence as though she was waiting for him to answer questions that only she could hear. One evening, I noticed Rachel had begun burning incense again, thick, cloying smoke that made the entire upstairs reek of something sharp and bitter. Emily complained about the smell, but I told her to leave it. Whatever Rachel was doing was only further evidence of her obsession spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on ensuring the fallout was contained. Stephen had been fired from his job after Cassandra escalated the evidence to his employer's corporate office. Rachel's affair partner was now unemployed and under siege from his own wife, who had apparently begun divorce proceedings. Word spread quickly in their professional circles, isolating him from the connections he had once relied on. Rachel, of course, knew all of this. The missed calls and unread messages on her phone told me she wasn't willing, or able, to salvage what was left of her relationship with Stephen. If she felt any remorse, she didn't show it. Instead, her behavior became more erratic. I started to notice little signs that Rachel was trying to reclaim control in her own twisted way. One night, I walked into the kitchen and found her arranging crystals in a circular pattern on the table, muttering something low and rhythmic. She froze when she saw me, her hands hovering over the arrangement like she'd been caught red-handed. "I'm cleansing the energy," she said abruptly, her voice defensive. I didn't respond, simply watching as she scrambled to gather the crystals and shove them into a small pouch. Her movements were frantic, almost panicked, as though she could feel the balance of power slipping further and further from her grasp. Emily kept her distance from Rachel entirely, which seemed to hurt Rachel more than anything else. Her attempts to engage Emily were met with polite but cold refusals, and eventually, Rachel stopped trying. Emily spent most of her time in her room or with friends, leaving me to navigate the tension in the house alone. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Rachel walked into the kitchen holding a manila folder. Her expression was hollow, but her hands gripped the folder tightly, her knuckles white. "I want to talk," she said, placing the folder on the counter. Inside was a letter, an apology, or at least her attempt at one. She wrote about feeling trapped, unappreciated, and desperate to reignite what she claimed we'd lost. She framed her actions as misguided but well-intentioned, a last-ditch effort to save our marriage. It wasn't enough. Her words rang hollow against the weight of everything she'd done. Manipulating me, orchestrating an affair, and involving Emily in her chaos weren't acts of desperation, they were choices. Calculated, deliberate choices. I didn't say much as I handed the folder back to her. Her face fell as she realized her words hadn't changed anything. "I'll be filing for divorce," I said calmly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Rachel didn't argue. She just nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She left the kitchen without another word, retreating once again to the isolation of her room. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. For me, for Emily, and for the future we deserved, free from Rachel's manipulation and betrayal. The days after I told Rachel I was filing for divorce were quieter than I expected, but the quiet was uneasy, like the calm before another storm. Rachel barely left her room except for necessities, and when she did, her movements were stiff and deliberate, as if every step required immense effort. Emily and I fell into a routine that avoided Rachel entirely. Emily stayed out late with friends or buried herself in her schoolwork, and I spent most of my time coordinating with Jennifer. The paperwork was already in progress, and Jennifer's efficiency was a steadying presence in an otherwise chaotic situation. Rachel, however, wasn't completely passive. I began to notice signs that she was trying to regain control of the narrative. One morning, I found her at the dining table with a notebook and a pen, scribbling furiously. She looked up when I entered, her eyes narrowing. Without a word, she snapped the notebook shut and walked out, clutching it tightly to her chest. I had no idea what she was planning, but I wasn't about to let my guard down. The first official move in the divorce process came when Rachel was served with the papers. I'd chosen to have them delivered while Emily was at school, sparing her the scene. When Rachel opened the envelope, I saw the flash of disbelief on her face, followed by anger. She cornered me in the kitchen, waving the papers in her hand. Her voice was sharp and accusatory, laced with a bitterness I hadn't seen before. Though she tried to make me feel guilty, I kept my responses measured and emotionless. "This is your doing," she spat, her words laced with venom. "You're tearing this family apart." But her words had no effect on me anymore. The weight of her manipulation and betrayal had built a wall I couldn't break down, even if I wanted to. Her outburst ended as abruptly as it had begun, and she retreated to her room, slamming the door behind her. Meanwhile, Emily became increasingly involved in the process, whether she wanted to be or not. Rachel's parents, after hearing about the divorce, began reaching out to Emily, attempting to sway her into reconciling with Rachel. The pressure weighed heavily on her, but Emily was firm in her resolve. She avoided their calls when she could and confided in me when she couldn't. "I don't think I can face her right now," Emily said one evening, sitting on the edge of the couch. She twisted her hands in her lap, her voice tight with frustration. "You don't have to," I assured her. "This isn't your responsibility." Jennifer advised me to document everything Rachel said or did during this time, especially anything that could be construed as an attempt to manipulate or intimidate Emily. Though Rachel hadn't crossed any clear lines yet, her behavior was erratic enough to warrant concern. Then came the first legal meeting. Rachel and I sat across from each other in a sterile conference room, our respective lawyers on either side. Jennifer was calm and composed, a steady counterbalance to Rachel's lawyer, who was already taking an aggressive stance. Rachel barely looked at me during the meeting, her focus fixed on Jennifer, as though she could will her into submission. When the discussion turned to financial disclosures and custody arrangements, Rachel's facade cracked slightly. Her frustration spilled over in clipped responses and thinly veiled jabs at my character. Jennifer remained unfazed, handling each of Rachel's objections with grace and precision. Watching her work was oddly satisfying, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. As the meeting drew to a close, Rachel's lawyer hinted at potential complications with my evidence, suggesting it could be discredited if it came to court. Jennifer's response was a quiet but firm dismissal, making it clear that our case was solid. When we left the room, Rachel lingered behind, her expression unreadable. I didn't stop to speak to her. There was nothing left to say. That night, back at home, I finally felt the smallest flicker of relief. The divorce was no longer just a plan. It was in motion. Rachel's hold on our lives was loosening, and though there was still a long road ahead, the path forward was finally clear. The calm didn't last long. In the weeks following the legal meeting, Rachel began to lash out in ways that were both petty and calculated. Her retreat into her room was over. Instead, she moved through the house like a storm, making her presence impossible to ignore. It started with small things, rearranging furniture, loudly slamming doors, leaving passive-aggressive notes about chores or household expenses. She seemed determined to remind Emily and me that she wasn't going to disappear quietly. Emily was her primary target. Rachel's frustration at being ignored boiled over into subtle, guilt-laden comments whenever they crossed paths. She would remark on how disrespectful Emily had become or lament how broken the family was. Emily rarely responded, but the strain was evident in her posture and the way she avoided Rachel even more than before. The real escalation came when Rachel began reaching out to family and friends, spinning her own version of the story. According to her, I was the one who had betrayed her trust, prying into her private life and invading her personal space. She framed the divorce as a rash decision driven by my paranoia and lack of communication. Rachel's parents were the most vocal supporters of her narrative. They started calling me regularly, demanding explanations and insisting that I reconsider. When I refused to engage, they turned their attention to Emily, pressuring her to mediate between us. One evening, after yet another tense phone call with her grandparents, Emily broke down. She sat on the living room floor, her back against the couch, tears streaming down her face as she vented her frustration. "She's ruining everything," Emily said, her voice shaking. "I don't understand how she can act like this, like none of it is her fault." I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry this, Emily," I told her. "This is between me and your mom. Let me handle it." The next day, I brought the issue to Jennifer. She advised me to document Rachel's behavior and any attempts to involve Emily in the conflict. If necessary, we could request an order to limit Rachel's communication with Emily during the divorce process. Rachel's retaliation wasn't limited to emotional manipulation. She began making vague threats about exposing me, hinting at things she could say to tarnish my reputation. Though I doubted she had anything substantial, the possibility of her spreading rumors was a concern. Jennifer suggested preemptive damage control. I reached out to a few close friends and colleagues, sharing a brief, honest explanation of the situation. I didn't go into the details of Rachel's manipulation or her correspondence with Mrs. Mithril. Those revelations were reserved for the courtroom. Instead, I focused on the facts. We were divorcing, it was contentious, and Rachel might try to stir up drama. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Most people expressed sympathy and assured me they wouldn't buy into any gossip. Knowing I had a network of allies helped alleviate some of the tension. Rachel, however, seemed to sense that her attempts to control the narrative were faltering. Her behavior grew even more erratic. One afternoon, I found her in the kitchen, furiously scrubbing the counters while muttering under her breath. The air was thick with the smell of cleaning chemicals, and her movements were frantic, almost mechanical. She didn't look at me as I entered the room, but her voice cut through the silence. "You think you've won, don't you?" I didn't respond. There was no point in engaging her when she was like this. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving her to stew in her frustration. By the end of the week, it was clear that Rachel was losing her grip, not just on the situation, but on herself. Her plans had unraveled, her support system was crumbling, and her attempts to retaliate were backfiring. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Rachel's retaliation might have been chaotic, but it was far from over. She was cornered, and cornered people often lash out in the most dangerous ways. Rachel's escalating behavior reached its breaking point within days. The storm brewing inside her spilled out in unpredictable ways, slamming cabinets, pacing the house muttering to herself, and leaving cryptic notes on the kitchen counter about loyalty and betrayal. It was as if she was trying to reclaim control through sheer force of will, but every attempt only highlighted how far things had spiraled out of her hands. Emily grew quieter, retreating even further into her room or leaving the house entirely whenever Rachel was around. I could see the toll this was taking on her, but I had no way to shield her completely from the chaos. Rachel's attempts to engage with Emily became more aggressive, ranging from guilt-tripping to outright blaming her for the growing rift in the family. Emily refused to respond, but her silence only seemed to provoke Rachel more. The tension came to a head one evening when Rachel, after another long phone call with her parents, stormed into the living room. She moved with purpose, her eyes cold and her jaw set. She didn't speak directly to me but instead began cleaning the bookshelves with unnecessary force, knocking over framed photos and muttering under her breath. I stayed at the dining table, pretending to focus on paperwork, but my attention never left her. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and I knew something was about to snap. Rachel finally broke the silence by grabbing one of the frames she had knocked over and holding it up to the light. It was a family photo from years ago, Emily's high school graduation, when we'd all smiled for the camera, oblivious to what was to come. Rachel stared at it for a long moment before slamming it onto the table, the glass cracking under her grip. She didn't say anything, but the message was clear. The image of a perfect family was gone, shattered as completely as the frame. Rachel's unraveling wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. She began flooding me with messages, long, rambling texts about how I'd failed her, how she'd sacrificed everything for our marriage, how she was the real victim. Her words were laced with thinly veiled threats, suggesting she might take drastic measures if she felt pushed any further. Jennifer reviewed the messages and advised caution. While they weren't explicit enough to warrant immediate legal action, they were another piece of the puzzle. A pattern of increasingly unstable behavior that could be used to bolster my case. At the same time, Rachel's behavior in the community was beginning to draw attention. Neighbors commented on her erratic comings and goings, the loud arguments she had over the phone in the yard, and the unusual smell of incense that sometimes wafted from the house. People started asking questions, but I kept my responses measured and vague, unwilling to feed the gossip mill. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening. I had just finished a phone call with Jennifer, discussing the next steps in the divorce, when I heard a loud crash from the living room. Rushing in, I found Rachel standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by broken glass and toppled furniture. Her face was flushed, her breathing ragged. She didn't say a word as she looked at me, her expression a mix of fury and despair. For a moment, I thought she might start screaming, but instead, she turned and left the house, slamming the door behind her. Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "Is she gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, reassuring her as best I could. But even as I cleaned up the mess Rachel had left behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Rachel had been pushed to her limit, and whatever came next would be her most desperate move yet. The house was eerily quiet after Rachel stormed out that Saturday evening. Emily stayed in her room, unwilling to come downstairs until she was sure Rachel wasn't coming back that night. I sat in the living room, staring at the broken glass and upturned furniture, trying to process the moment. Rachel had crossed into a place I didn't recognize, her desperation palpable and her behavior completely unpredictable. By the next morning, Rachel returned, slipping into the house like a shadow. She didn't make a scene, but her presence was impossible to ignore. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow, and she moved through the house as though she was merely a guest in a place that no longer felt like her own. 4 days, she barely spoke. She avoided me and Emily entirely, retreating into her room for long stretches of time. When she did emerge, it was to pace the house aimlessly, muttering to herself or scribbling notes in a journal she clutched like a lifeline. But the quiet didn't last. Rachel's behavior shifted again, her desperation morphing into erratic bursts of activity. She began making phone calls at odd hours, her voice rising and falling behind closed doors. Snatches of conversation reached me, pleas for understanding, vague insinuations about being wronged, and thinly veiled threats about taking control of her situation. Emily, still reeling from the tension, came to me late one evening. She sat on the edge of my bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She didn't say much, she didn't have to. The strain was written all over her face. I reassured her as best I could, promising that things were nearing an end and that she wouldn't have to live in this chaos for much longer. Then came the incident that solidified everything. One evening, I returned home to find Rachel in the kitchen, candles lit in a circle on the table. The scene was unsettling, the dim flicker of flames casting shadows across her face, the low hum of words she was chanting under her breath. She didn't acknowledge me when I entered. Her focus was entirely on the objects in front of her. A photograph of me, strands of what I assumed were my hair, and a small vial of liquid I didn't recognize. The sight sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just Rachel playing at spirituality. This was something far darker, something that confirmed how far she'd fallen into her obsession with control. I didn't say anything. Confronting her in that moment felt dangerous, so I simply turned and left the room. Later, I called Jennifer and described what I'd seen. She listened carefully, her tone serious as she told me to document everything, even if it seemed insignificant. Rachel's actions weren't just erratic, they were alarming. Jennifer suggested filing a motion for temporary sole occupancy of the house, citing Rachel's instability and the potential risk to Emily. It wasn't a step I wanted to take, but I knew it might be necessary to protect both of us. Over the next few days, I quietly prepared for the possibility of escalating the situation legally. I kept my distance from Rachel, avoiding her attempts to provoke me into arguments. She tried several times to engage, her tone swinging wildly between pleading and accusing, but I refused to take the bait. Emily, sensing the shift, asked me one evening if we were safe. Her question hit me harder than I expected, a reminder of how much Rachel's behavior had affected her. I assured her that we were, though I knew my words were only half the battle. Rachel's desperation had reached a dangerous peak, and I knew the next move had to be mine. It was time to bring an end to the chaos once and for all. The culmination of everything, Rachel's erratic behavior, her escalating desperation, and her obsession with control, came to a head just days after I made the decision to escalate legally. It started with a call from Jennifer, who informed me that the motion for temporary sole occupancy had been filed. If approved, it would grant Emily and me the right to remain in the house while requiring Rachel to leave. The filing was a line in the sand, one Rachel must have sensed. That evening, she tried one final move to regain control. I came home to find Rachel waiting in the living room, her journal open on the coffee table and a stack of printed emails beside it. Her expression was calm, too calm, the kind of forced composure that hinted at the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. Without looking at me, she gestured to the seat across from her. I hesitated but sat down, careful to keep my distance. Rachel's voice was quiet but intense as she began to speak, recounting the sacrifices she claimed to have made for our family and the ways she believed I had wronged her. The speech was rehearsed, each word carefully chosen to elicit guilt or sympathy. But I'd spent too many nights unraveling her plans and seeing her manipulation for what it was. Her words didn't carry the weight she thought they would. When she realized I wasn't responding, her tone shifted. She reached for the emails, pushing them toward me with a sharp motion. They were printouts of our correspondence with Jennifer, evidence she'd somehow obtained. Rachel leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and triumph, accusing me of betraying her trust and conspiring to destroy her life. I didn't flinch. Instead, I calmly reminded her of the things she had done: the emails to Mrs. Mithril, the charm bracelet, the binding spells, the affair with Stephen. For every accusation she threw at me, I countered with cold, unvarnished truth. Rachel's composure cracked. She slammed her hand down on the table, her voice rising as she accused me of twisting the narrative, of making her the villain in a story where she believed she was the victim. Her words grew more disjointed, her arguments unraveling with each attempt to justify her actions. Finally, I stood, the conversation reaching its inevitable end. I told her that the motion for sole occupancy had been filed and that, if approved, she would need to leave the house. Her face twisted with a mix of fury and disbelief, but she didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her journal and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The next day, the motion was granted. Rachel was given 48 hours to vacate the house. The decision was met with another round of accusations and threats, but there was nothing she could do to stop the process. When the deadline arrived, Rachel packed her belongings in silence. Emily stayed in her room, unwilling to face her mother during those final hours. I kept my distance as well, knowing that anything I said would only add fuel to the fire. As Rachel left, she paused in the doorway, turning back to look at me. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of anger, regret, and something I couldn't quite place. But she didn't say anything. She simply walked out, leaving the house, and the chaos she had created, behind her. The silence that followed her departure was almost overwhelming. For the first time in months, the house felt calm. Emily emerged from her room, her shoulders relaxing as she realized Rachel was truly gone. In the days that followed, we began to rebuild. The divorce proceedings continued, but without Rachel in the house, the tension that had dominated our lives began to lift. Emily and I found a new rhythm, a sense of normalcy that had been absent for far too long. Rachel's manipulation and betrayal had left scars, but they were scars we could heal from. As I stood in the quiet of our home one evening, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. We were free.